London was drowning in fog when he appeared, his eyes wild, his movements unnatural as he weaved through the crowd. He was stalking the guard, inching closer, waiting, and then he lunged. What happened next shocked everyone. London was wrapped in a cold fog. A thick gray mist blanketed the streets, swallowing them in damp air. The tall facades of old buildings looked gloomy, colorless, as if someone had drained all warmth and life from the city. The overcast sky hung low over Buckingham Palace Square, leaving no hope for sunlight. It felt as if even time moved slower here, as if the fog wasn't just making it harder to breathe. It was weighing down the very seconds themselves. Tourists, bundled in scarves and raised collars, scattered across the square, clicking their cameras, chatting in different languages, laughing as if trying to push away the stillness that loomed over the city. Camera flashes flickered here and there, but even they couldn't brighten the day. Some filmed videos, others simply gazed at the majestic palace. The atmosphere was familiar. Awed tourists, the royal guard standing tall and motionless, people hurrying about their daily routines. But in this crowd, there was someone who wasn't in a hurry, someone who wasn't smiling, someone who hadn't taken a single picture. He stood out, not because he was particularly tall or dressed flamboyantly. Quite the opposite. He looked wrong, small-framed, thin, with hollow cheeks and a gaunt face. His unkempt, overgrown hair stuck out in odd directions, as if he had long forgotten what a comb was. A dirty, unwashed t-shirt hung off his bony shoulders like a sack, and his shapeless pants barely clung to his hips, held up only by a worn-out belt. His sneakers, long-stained and tattered, left damp prints on the wet pavement. But the most unsettling thing about him was his eyes. Wild, wide open, glinting with an almost fanatical shine, as if he saw something no one else could. His pupils darted from side to side, searching for something or someone in the crowd. He licked his chapped lips occasionally, muttering to himself under his breath, though no one could make out his words. And then he found his target. The royal guard, tall, unshaken, a proud embodiment of discipline and British tradition. His red uniform fit perfectly, his boots gleamed with immaculate polish, and the towering bearskin hat made his silhouette even more imposing. He was like a statue, a living symbol of royal authority, heritage, and unwavering strength. At that moment, something twisted in the stranger's expression. A shift, an unnatural gleam in his eyes. He leaned forward, carefully, almost imperceptibly. The crowd paid no attention to him. He moved as if dissolving into the sea of tourists, blending into the background noise. He would stop sometimes, as if calculating something, then freeze in place, his eyes locked onto his target's every move. And then he would inch closer, closer, even closer. His fingers began to twitch nervously. His breathing grew shallow and uneven. He was now almost upon his target, and something in his movements made it clear he had no intention of stopping. The fog thickened, creeping over the square, swallowing the pavement like dense milk spilled over stone. Gray clouds loomed overhead, making the day even darker, more lifeless. People in the square pulled up their collars, hiding their faces from the cold air. Some tightened their hoods but continued taking pictures, clinging to the illusion of joy in this damp, somber London. Camera flashes flickered, reflecting off the wet pavement, but even they couldn't pierce through the heavy, grim atmosphere. The crowd moved in waves, chaotically, with laughter and shouts, with endless attempts to capture the perfect selfie against the backdrop of the royal palace. Some waved their arms, trying to get their friends' attention, while others pointed at the guards, hoping for any kind of reaction. It was an ordinary scene, familiar. But among the sea of people there was one who acted differently. He wasn't taking pictures. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even speaking. He stood still, hunched over slightly, his gaze locked onto a single point. A perfectly motionless, disciplined, unwavering figure. The royal guard stood exactly where he was supposed to, tall, proud, unyielding, the embodiment of tradition and discipline. And this man was watching him the way a predator watches its prey. People passed by, occasionally casting quick glances at him, but no one paid him much attention. He blended into the crowd, lost among hundreds of other tourists. But if someone had stopped and looked at him closely, they would have felt it, a strange sense of unease. There was something deeply unsettling about his posture. His head tilted downward, his shoulders tensed, and his lips moved as if whispering something to himself. His eyes, dark, wild, burning with a feverish shine, darted from side to side, calculating something in his head. A step, subtle, cautious, like an animal stalking its prey. The crowd buzzed around him, but he heard only the dull pounding of his own heartbeat, closer, even closer. His fingers twitched slightly. He clenched his fists a few times, as if trying to contain the storm building inside him. A step. Now he was within arm's reach. The guard remained perfectly still. But if he could feel a gaze, he would have sensed how this madman was drilling into him with his eyes. The tourist was breathing heavily, deeply. A sudden gust of cold wind made him shove his hands into his pockets, but he quickly pulled them out, as if he didn't trust himself. The crowd carried on, unaware. He could already feel the warmth of the human body in front of him. The guard was so close. Just one more step and the tourist could touch the uniform. But he didn't rush. He savored this moment. Drew it out. Let it consume him. Images swirled in his head of what was about to happen. How his fingers would clutch the red fabric. How he would lunge. How he would coil around the guard like a snake, sinking his teeth in. How the fabric of the uniform would feel against his lips. How the guard's neck would tighten under his grip. He didn't know why he was about to do this. He only knew that he had to. His mouth parted slightly. He was murmuring something again. The crowd suspected nothing. People kept taking pictures. He froze. Like a statue. Like a piece of the square. Like a block of concrete blending into the pavement. But inside him, a storm raged. And then, a flash of movement. The tourist lunged forward. The hunter had begun his attack. The guard didn't even have time to react. Everything happened in an instant, like a shadow, like an arrow shot from a bow. The crazed tourist lunged forward. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grimace, baring his teeth like a wild animal. His hands curled into claw-like talons, reaching straight for the unmoving sentinel's neck. His leap was sudden, but in its chaotic madness, there was an eerie precision, like a predator who knew its prey would not fight back. The crowd erupted in screams. People recoiled. Some dropped their phones. Others covered their eyes, bracing for the worst. In that moment, the silence of the square was shattered into pieces. Sounds turned sharp and frantic. The shrieks of women, the shouts of men, the pounding echoes of footsteps as some tried to flee. The madman's teeth snapped at empty air, just a fraction of an inch from the guard's neck. The soldier hadn't moved. He hadn't even had time to process the danger. But the lunatic's hands had latched onto his shoulders, gripping with the force of a steel vise. His legs locked around the soldier's waist, wrapping around him like a serpent squeezing its prey. He clung to him, a grotesque, unshakable parasite. The guard stumbled back, but the attacker refused to let go. He tightened his grip, pressing himself against him like a leech fused to flesh. His breath was hot, damp, heavy with adrenaline and some kind of twisted animalistic ecstasy. He whispered something, gibberish, guttural sounds, nothing human. "Oh my God! He's attacking him! Somebody do something!" The screams of the crowd grew louder, but no one moved. No one knew what to do. Some watched in horror, others in a morbid, hypnotized fascination, as if witnessing a scene from a horror movie. Some still kept recording, their minds refusing to accept that this wasn't a prank, wasn't a stunt. This was real, and it was spiraling out of control. The guard tried to shake him off, but the man latched on tighter, writhing like a worm, slick and suffocating. He clung to him, moving his limbs around as if searching for a better grip. And then, he did something even worse. He pressed his teeth against the soldier's neck. Not biting, not yet, but testing, squeezing, seeing how far he could go. Thud! They crashed to the ground. The guard had lost his balance. The weight of the psychopath had been too sudden, too unexpected. The cold stone of the pavement met them with a sickening thud. The soldier's red uniform smeared with dust, his boots striking the cobblestones with a dull impact, and the madman, now on top, moaned, not in pain, but in pleasure. He shifted immediately, pinning the guard beneath him, pressing down with his full weight. His eyes burned, his mouth twisted into a sick grin. He held him down, refusing to let go. His legs locked around his waist, his hands clamped onto his shoulders. His breathing was fast, heavy, like a cornered animal. The crowd froze. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had expected the madman to shout something, maybe mock the guard, try to make him laugh, but not this. No one had expected an actual attack. And not like this. Not like something out of a nightmare, something so primal and grotesque it felt like it had clawed its way out of the darkest depths of the human mind. But his moment of dominance would only last for a second. Security reacted faster than lightning. The crowd was still processing what had just happened, but two guards were already in motion. Their heavy boots slammed against the stone pavement. The air shook with the sheer force of their explosive speed. The black uniforms of the security detail flashed through the chaos, cutting through the scene like a blade through fabric. The first strike landed directly into the attacker's solar plexus. A sharp, precise, and brutal impact. Executed perfectly, without hesitation. The madman jerked violently, his body arching backward from the force, his mouth gaping in a silent scream, a guttural wheeze escaping his throat. His fingers, which had just been digging into the soldier's uniform, went limp. But it wasn't enough. The second strike, a calculated, bone-crushing blow to the ribs. A shriek tore from his throat, his body convulsing, muscles locking up in shock. He twisted, flailed, but the guards were already on him. Two grabbed him by the arms. A third snapped his legs out from under him with a single swift maneuver. He thrashed, writhed, desperately trying to lunge back at his prey, but the power was no longer his. The crowd erupted, the fear morphing into exhilaration. A single second, and the entire atmosphere exploded into a roar of applause. Phones shot up into the air, capturing every second. Some people screamed, some just stood there, mouths agape. Just moments ago, this had felt like a horror movie. Now, it was real life. Holy shit! That's what he deserved! Who is this psycho? The restrained madman gasped for breath. Sweat drenched his face, his hair stuck to his forehead, his eyes darting around like a caged animal. But the most terrifying part? He was laughing. And his laughter was monstrous. It didn't sound human. It was broken, a jarring, metallic screech like the sound of something being ripped apart. He hiccuped, giggled, choked on his own breath, but kept laughing as his hands were being forced behind his back. I almost... His voice trembled, his mouth twitching into a sick, nervous grin. I almost did it. Click. The handcuffs locked into place. The cold steel snapped shut around his wrists with an unyielding finality. His arms twitched, but resistance was pointless. The guards lifted him off the ground, their grip iron-tight, unyielding, allowing zero chance for another attack. He no longer struggled, But his eyes, still burning with madness, never stopped searching. And then, the soldier he had tried to take down rose, slowly, methodically, with absolute control. A single second, and he was already standing tall, as if nothing had happened. His movements were precise, practiced, without a single wasted motion. Without a sound, he adjusted his uniform, brushing off invisible dust from the red fabric. And then, he stepped back into position, back straight, eyes forward, emotionless, unshaken, as if no one had just tried to drag him to the ground, as if no one had just thrown themselves at him in a frenzied attack, as if his discipline was untouchable. The crowd fell silent. They waited. They expected something, a reaction, a glance, anything. Something to prove he was human, to show that he had felt it, that it had shaken him, even just a little. But he didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He didn't move an inch, as if nothing had happened, as if it had been a ghost, not a man, who had tried to break him, as if he could never be broken at all. The video went viral, spreading at terrifying speed, like a disease. It was being shared in private messages, discussed in comments, broadcasted on news networks. People watched it on their phones, in subway stations, on cafe screens, whispered about it to each other, overwhelmed with emotions. Every frame was something wild, unexplainable, and absolutely breathtaking. There he was, unkempt, eyes burning with insanity, lurking in the crowd like a predator before the pounce. There, his sudden lunge, a jump that looked like a rabid beast's attack. There, the moment he latched onto the guard, gripping him with unnatural obsession. There, the thunderous crash of their bodies hitting the pavement. There, the panic in the crowd, screams of tourists, cries of children. And there, the swift, calculated response of security. And the final shot, the royal guard, back in position, as if nothing had happened, as if there had been no attack, as if no one had tried to take him down, humiliate him, break him. But millions of people knew the truth. It had happened. And it was something beyond comprehension. That same day, world headlines exploded across the media. Madman attacks Royal Guard. A villain straight out of a movie, in real life. An assault on the British crown. London maniac. What was that? Security responded instantly. Royal Guards, symbols of unbreakable strength. The world is in shock. Social media was merciless. The comments flooded in, an endless torrent of anger, mockery, and pure shock. How was this psycho even let out of a hospital? This maniac belongs in a cage. How could something like this even happen? Lunatics are everywhere. Respect to the guards. They're like stone. I would have panicked. This guy is possessed. Look at his eyes. People like him need to be locked away, permanently. The internet turned him into a figure of pure hatred. People watched the footage over and over, analyzing his movements, his expression, his gaze. They debated. Was he mentally ill, or was this a deliberate stunt for attention? What did he want? What was he trying to accomplish? But no matter how much they discussed it, everything always led to the same conclusion. He wanted to break a man. But he broke himself instead. And the attacker himself? He barely remembered anything. His mind was a murky, sluggish mess of distorted images and muffled sounds. The voices of security, loud, sharp, but strangely muffled, as if he heard them through thick glass. A blinding flashlight in his face, making him instinctively turn away. Strong hands twisting his wrists, the cold bite of handcuffs, firm grips shoving him into a vehicle. He tried to speak, but his tongue wouldn't move. His consciousness drifted. One moment he was in a gray hallway, then in darkness, Then in blinding light again, everything shifted, everything blurred. He didn't remember being taken to the police station. He didn't remember being yelled at. He didn't remember being thrown into a holding cell. He didn't remember the first charges being read to him. But one thing he remembered. Clearly, vividly, without distortion, the way his target stood, unshaken, unbroken, as if he didn't exist at all. A low, ringing noise filled his skull. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image wouldn't disappear. The realization that he had lost. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was realizing that he wasn't just defeated, he was insignificant. He had wanted to be a predator, a hunter, someone who destroys order, breaks lives, instills fear. But reality was different. He was nobody. And the man he had tried to humiliate, he was still standing, without a trace of fear, without a hint of weakness, just standing there. And that broke him. Suddenly, he screamed. A raw, guttural, drawn-out scream. A harsh, broken cry echoed against the cold walls of his cell. He clutched his head, slammed his forehead against the wall, tried to shake the image out of his mind, but it wouldn't leave. That cold, regal stare. That absolute indifference to his attack. That unyielding strength, more powerful than his rage. He screamed again, but this time it was pure despair. And in that moment, he understood. That night was the end of him, because from now on, that image would haunt him forever. The royal guard stood at his post, straight, unyielding, like a statue. He didn't adjust his uniform, didn't glance at the crowd, which, just minutes ago, had been screaming, gasping, and erupting in chaos, as if nothing had happened, as if there had been no attack, no madness, no man who had tried to destroy him. His calmness, his stillness, this was his answer to the world. The royal guard is not just a man. He is a symbol of discipline, a symbol of resilience, a symbol of Britain itself. But if the guard remained unshaken, his attacker was forever changed. There was no more manic grin twisting his face. His eyes, which had once burned with wild fire, were now empty, lifeless, the eyes of a man who had seen something beyond his comprehension. He sat on a hard chair in a white room, his arms bound in a straitjacket. The smooth walls of the psychiatric ward enclosed him, sealing him off from reality. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He didn't resist. He just rocked back and forth, muttering the same thing under his breath. "He didn't break," whispered. Again and again. He couldn't understand it. His mind, filled with chaos, built for destruction, for domination, for crushing others, was now trapped in an endless loop. Because in that moment, when he had looked into the guard's eyes, he had seen something he could never comprehend. How can a man stand so straight when being attacked? How can someone show no fear when faced with a beast? How can someone be so utterly unbreakable? It killed him. It shattered him. A doctor, watching him through the observation window, sighed tiredly before turning to another staff member. "He doesn't talk. He doesn't react. He just keeps repeating the same sentence." "What sentence?" the guard asked. The doctor ran a hand over his forehead. "He didn't break. He didn't break." Outside, the rain fell, cold, light, gray, just like the day it all happened. 2 police officers stood guard at the clinic entrance, watching the passing cars with bored indifference. To them, this case was closed, just another lunatic who crossed the line. They had seen plenty like him before, and they knew he wouldn't be the last. Meanwhile, far from the clinic, back on that very same square in front of Buckingham Palace, the royal guard stood at his post, straight, resilient, unshakable. as he had for hundreds of years, as he would for hundreds more.